Hey.
I can cut it.
Yeah. If David's here, Joe can't be far behind. Oh, hi, Joe.
Hey, he got his hair cut.
Boy,
Today, didn't you?
you got it
Today.
shaved, boy.
Summer. Adam, here's the
It's a little wild last night when I saw it.
I have to do the same thing to mine.
Hey, Joe, how you doing?
Good, how you doing, buddy?
What's that?
Jack coming?
He's in the men's room.
He's here. He's close at hand. All right. Time for our annual show and tell. I should have a pointer. God, why don't I get up? Well, this has to go fast because we're into that season where the one little window air conditioner in that room
Circulates.
it does, but
Not well.
the 9 of us are going to overpower it very quickly. So don't breathe, anybody, and we'll just get through this. Don't give out any body heat or warm the place up. Thanks for coming this afternoon. I'll try to get through this quickly, although we had a dry run in Saranac Lake this morning. I mean, it was a real one, but usually this is the first event, so we practiced, and we got this down to about 25 minutes. Now we're going to shoot for 20. Our surveys went out on the 28th of March. We're still getting dribs and drabs in today, and in fact there were 200 on the desk that hadn't been tabulated as of this morning. But as of yesterday afternoon, we've tabulated 3,702, which is a record. Previous high was 3,230 back in the late 90s. So we're looking at about a 30% increase in the total response, partly due to the fact that many more voters registered last year, so we have a larger pool to draw from, partly due to the fact that we did an extensive outreach with point of sale distribution in grocery stores, convenience stores, gas stations, town halls, and libraries, and we received a number from people who probably are not yet voters, and that's going to be interesting as well. The results in your folder were tabulated at about 1,900. They have not changed appreciably. That's plus or minus 2.5%. The results are all within that range of error. So we'll go with what we printed out 3 weeks ago when we prepared for the release. North Country residents once again have made their voices heard, and they're speaking loud and clear on a number of issues where we have near unanimous agreement. I begin with the issue of emergency communication on the Adirondack Northway. Nearly 90% said that the state should ensure cell phone coverage on the Northway and that they wanted a working emergency communication system there. 77% said that if need be, the state should pay for it using existing cell phone tax revenues. 90% said abandoned fire towers in the Adirondack Park should be used for cell antennas. We didn't ask them about other antennas, but I presume they would feel the same way about state police, fire, emergency preparedness, and so forth. On the, I'm sorry, would somebody hand me an actual tabulated, I just want to double check the numbers as I'm going through this. There, thank you, Pat. While we're on the Northway, we also asked a question about the controversial Border Patrol checkpoint at North Hudson. Now let me reiterate, I support the Border Patrol. I have supported them from day one. They belong wherever they deem necessary to protect the country, and if it's in the middle of the Northway, that's their call, and they have a right, authority, and my support in doing it. However, as you know, many citizens have issues with the Border Patrol checkpoint as it is. So we asked, do you support it? Do you support continuing it? Now if you look at the chart up here, by an almost even measure, the voters say no. Yes, no. 42.7% are in favor of it, continuing it, and 41.3% are against continuing it. We probed inside this no a little bit. We asked, if you said no, should it be moved, 24%, or permanently closed, 17%. Now there's some good in this for everybody. Those who say nobody minds it need to sit up and take notice that fully half of the people who had an opinion have a problem with it. Those who support the Homeland Security need and the Border Patrol doing its job can look to the fact that only 17% of all those surveyed said they didn't want it there at all, or didn't want it anywhere at all. I've met with both the commander of Troop B and the Chief Border Patrol agent from the Swanton sector in the last week. We've discussed not only the findings of the survey, but other issues in general. And I think we would all agree that a 17% number is really not out of the ordinary for any intrusive law enforcement method anywhere. I'm not overly surprised that it's that number. I am interested that there seems to be a sizable percentage of people who think we could do a better job of it. And as I said to Major Person and Chief Border Patrol Agent Sweeney, they have my support, and to the extent that I can influence at the support of the state of New York to continue to do their job in a better, safer way. Let's move on. The state and the Adirondacks. A year and a half ago, shortly after the sale of the Domtar lands were announced, I had a chance to meet with the fire chief for the Mountain View Owl's Head Fire Department. And in discussing the state opening up the Domtar lands, it came up that this could put a significant additional burden on this very small department with less than 20 members, covering 2 towns and half the entire town of Belmont. So in discussing with the fire chief, I took an idea that we had brainstormed back to the governor and to the executive agencies and the DEC. And here's the idea. If the state's buying and opening up a lot of land, particularly opening up land for outdoor recreation in the winter, snowmobiling, ATVs, and so forth, opening up backcountry where there aren't many roads, recognize that this one fire department in the year before last had 6 snowmobile fatalities in its own fire district that they had to respond to. Theoretically, opening up to thousands of more ATVers or snowmobilers could increase that number. We hope it wouldn't, but emergency preparedness is all about planning. So what would the state feel, and what would the people feel about this? When the state buys and opens up for recreation large tracts of land, that it include as a component of the whole land purchase package a grant program that would send money to the fire department or departments responsible for those newly opened lands to assist them in at least being equipped for the kind of backcountry rescue, the kind of additional emergency service that they might encounter. And by a overwhelming 6-to-1 majority, 66% of the voters said that was a good idea. I'm glad to hear that, because we're going to pursue that idea, and now we know we have the backing of a large number of people.
They already pay, when the state buys the land, they already pay taxes on it
They
to
do.
the community.
They do.
This would be above that.
This would be, yes, this would, my idea would be that recognize you're instantly, as soon as you open up that land, you're going to have a quantum increase, or potentially a quantum increase in responsibility for that fire department. If it's in the heart of the Adirondacks, it's very likely that it's a small fire department, that it doesn't have a lot of funds to begin with, or the tax base isn't very big to support it. So yes, that's what we're thinking about. Should the state create a dedicated ATV fund and build trails? Now, the survey was written about 2 weeks before the budget was adopted. The survey went out 3 days before the budget was adopted. At that time, we didn't know for sure that we were going to adopt this in the budget. It has been adopted, and I'm gratified to see that, again, 2/3 of the people said that was something they favored. Only 20% opposed it. On the other question of banning ATVs on all state land, banning any ATV activity on any state land or state easement land in the park, a very extreme extension of actually what is not even as far as the ATV policy now goes. Interestingly enough, almost Well, a little bit more than a quarter,
Yeah.
1 in 4, said yes.
Yeah.
Now, it's no secret that I support fair treatment of ATV owners. That if we're going to collect $25 a piece every year from every bike sold and every bike operated, that we ought to be building trails and creating a place for these folks to ride. It's no secret that if you're going to build trails in the North Country, and they're going to be good trails that actually go where people want to go, sooner or later you're going to encounter some state land or some state easement land where you're going to want ATV trails on. It's interesting that although 55% said don't ban them, that as many as 1 in 4 said ban them. The message I think here is that ATV clubs, organized ATV advocates, including myself, have some work to do to get a broader public support for what now is already state policy. We're underway. It may take 5, 6, 10 years to have enough trails where people begin to appreciate that having a trail or an area for every different kind of outdoor recreation will probably bring peace in the family. But until then, I would hope that everybody lets us go forward with the program and help everybody out and be fair to everybody. Empire's Zone program has also now been extended and reformed. At the time we asked the question, only just under 50% said continue it as it's written. A quarter said no, and a quarter weren't sure. I think the Empire Zone program is controversial in some quarters because it does afford tax breaks, and there have been some abuses where jobs had not necessarily been created. That's been reformed and cleaned up and tightened up a great deal. There is support for Empire Zone program, but it's certainly not as overwhelming as, say, cell phones on the Northway. Should we reenact the death penalty law or reactivate it? 65% to 20 say yes. That is lower than the absolute all-time high in the early 90s, but it's consistently up where it has been generally since the early 80s. So the North Country at least continues to support having a death penalty on the books. As you may know, the federal government says Americans shouldn't buy drugs in Canada, that the quality of drugs coming in from other countries can't be guaranteed, that they haven't received the same scrutinization by the FDA or the same approvals. At the same time, counties, towns, municipalities, senior groups everywhere are advocating going wherever they can go, Canada being the closest place, to get drugs at a lower price. You're also aware that the Canadian government, or at least some members of the government, are moving to try to ban the export of drugs sold under their subsidized program to Americans. Notwithstanding all these things are happening, we just wanted to know what people thought. Should Americans buy drugs in Canada? 72 to 14 said yes. The message is clear. Those of us in public office, if we have the opportunity to make it easier for that to happen, the people want us to do that. On another subject, however, the people are absolutely overwhelmingly by 7 to 1 against sending more state money to New York City schools. We're under a court order to do so. My own position agrees with that of the people. I'm gratified by this 70 to 10% support of what amounts to my own position because, as I've said many times, the lawsuit was brought in 1995. Since 1995, the state sends nearly $7 billion a year more to New York City than we did then. New York City schools have been taken over by the largest, most significant reform in the 20th and 21st centuries in over 100 years. The schools in New York City are already beginning to show signs of improvement. This year, for the first time in history, 4th and 8th grade reading scores in New York City schools showed no statistical difference at all between minority students and non-minority students. That is a tremendous improvement over the past, and it indicates that New York City schools, without the CFE additional money, are already on their way not only to recovery, but with parity with schools around the state. We need more money for North Country schools, for rural schools. We need a fair and balanced system across the state, and thankfully the people of the North Country agree with my position on that.
Who are
Now,
the 20% that aren't sure?
I don't know. Good question. One never knows. I'll talk about one of the other questions in a minute about what we're going to do to probe some additional information on this. And I do that because, frankly, I'm fascinated with this. I do this survey, and we take a lot of time writing questions. Sometimes they're provocative, sometimes they're middle of the road, sometimes they're way off at one end. We do it because we're trying to find out what people think. The next one is real amazing. I think the next one is the most startling, surprising result of all. Should the state take over Medicaid costs from the counties? Only 46% said yes. 18% said no. That is a 3-to-2 ratio. No, it's more than that. It's a 3-to-1 ratio in favor. But the interesting thing here is we asked the question the way most people assume it would happen. Should the state take over Medicaid and then the counties refund the taxes they're now collecting to pay for Medicaid? Most people who advocate state takeover of Medicaid do so in order to achieve property tax relief. So we posed the question exactly as the logical extension would be. Should the state take over Medicaid and the counties be required to refund all the taxes they now collect for Medicaid? Perhaps that qualifier was what
Through them out?
through the results as they are. I want to find out a little bit more about that because frankly I have been one of the strongest advocates for full state takeover of Medicaid on the presumption that the counties would then be able to offer tax relief. And if we're asking the question in a wrong way, we want to find out if the people really don't want this as strongly as we thought they did. We need to listen more closely to the people. On the
Chris.
next, go ahead.
On the chart, it says 35%, if I can see it right from here, are unsure.
Unsure.
Maybe it's
Maybe.
because they don't know what the counties, if the counties are actually gonna refund them. What do you
They don't.
think?
Possibly true. Whenever you get over 20% unsure, the first thing I want to ask is, did I ask the question clearly?
It sounded like they wanted to return it to the state.
Yeah, where does the money go
Maybe
that's
that's it.
being returned?
Maybe that's
Does it go to me, or
But it
does the
sounded,
county get to
when
play
you
with
first
it?
said it, sounded like that to me, that
Yeah.
return that money to the state.
Yeah,
That never occurred to me. I'm going to do two things, Pat, to reform our survey procedures. First, I'm going to think a little harder, and second, I'm going to have Jack edit the questions.
there you go.
Then now you're in big trouble.
Because clearly you're reading it in a way that hadn't occurred to me, and that you're probably right. Healthcare. Another question we asked exactly the way it's presumed to take place. If the government ran all healthcare, every government healthcare program in the world and everyone proposed in this country, although the advocates never talk about it, prohibits private insurance and prohibits private pay. All healthcare has to go through the government. As you know, Canadians who want to pay for their own health care have to come down here to do it, and they do. So we asked the question, again, being realistic, should the government be responsible for all health care with no third-party insurance or private pay permitted? And this is a question we've asked in various questions over the last 15 years. The 44 to 32% against is roughly the same proportion as the 55 to 35 against in 1994. And it goes up and down depending on which side of the argument is making more, getting more publicity and making more effective arguments at the time. That's not a surprising result. Nor is the support for a SUNY tuition policy that guarantees tuition for a freshman during the entire 4 years of his or her matriculation in the SUNY system. The next question, plus question 19, are questions we ask frequently. I always ask the question on rating my performance. This year we asked another question to get a little bit better handle on that. Specifically, how do you rate my performance in being accessible to you as a voter, you as a citizen? We had a large number of undecideds, and we were able to look at those surveys, and most of the undecideds fell into the category of this was a new voter or a new resident who hadn't lived here very long, and many of them actually wrote in response to that question, I haven't been here long enough to give you a fair answer. I don't know you yet. I've only been here a year. But I'm very gratified that 65% said I was, and I'm going to go out and try to find those 10 and make sure that I'm very accessible to them. All part of doing our job better. Also on the excellent good, 73% excellent good is about 6 points less than it was at the same time in 2002. So given last fall's election, one would say that might explain why it dropped off 6 points, but I for one am very glad that it only dropped off 6 points and that we continue to enjoy what appears to be a broad willingness, at least, to give us the benefit of the doubt, and we're going to work hard to earn that. And finally, let me close with what I think some of you may find the most interesting question of all. We knew, or we learned at the time of last fall's election, that the North Country, in voting against President Bush, I think President Bush lost this Assembly District by around 2,000 votes, while I was winning it by 2,000 votes. Clearly the war played a part in that. You could tell just talking to people on election day. A lot of folks came out to vote for the first time ever, for the first time in a dozen years, because they wanted to make a statement on the war. They wanted to vote for President Bush or John Kerry because of the war. And I think the war affected the election across the board. So looking back on that, a lot of that was speculation. We clearly didn't know how large the anti and pro-war factions were. How were we going to find out? So we posed two questions. And on this, we actually consulted with the Democrat majority in the Assembly because asking a question like this gets awfully close to asking a political poll type question. We want to make sure we didn't cross that line. We asked one question about what the governor and the state of New York should do vis-a-vis our National Guard troops. We asked another question about what voters felt their congressmen and U.S. senators should do about the U.S. role in Iraq. And we said, if the war in Iraq continues, should the governor, New York's governor, refuse to send New York Guard troops to that theater of action? The second question was, in those circumstances, would you support your congressmen and U.S. senators voting to pull our troops out of Iraq? Now look at the answers. On the question of the congressional action on the war in general, by a 45 to 38% margin, voters in the 110th Assembly District said Congress should pull the troops out of Iraq. The same people, however, said by 48 to 38% that the governor shouldn't pull New York troops out of the theater unilaterally. We had an opportunity last week to talk to several people who had answered the question, yes, pull the troops out of Iraq. So why'd you say the governor shouldn't do it, but the Congress should? And the answer was, we're against the war, but we don't believe it's the governor's responsibility or authority to act against the will of the country. The governor should support the country, whatever it is, but that's why we did it that way. That may explain it. But still a fascinating result that the North Country is almost evenly divided, and if anything, is more anti-war than pro-war. So did that color the election last fall? Everyone suspects it did. Do we now have a somewhat better idea what the dimensions of this are? Yes, we do. However, as fascinating as that is, I think the bottom line is this. Despite their differences, despite our differences on international issues, the voters of the 114th Assembly District are united on getting emergency telephones on the Northway. They're united on using abandoned fire towers for communications. They're united when it comes to being able to buy drugs in Canada. They're united that no more upstate dollars should go to pay for New York City schools. And they're reasonably united on other issues having to do with ATVs, land acquisition, SUNY tuition, and the death penalty. It's all in all a fascinating result, and I'd be happy to get into fascination a little more by listening to what you have to say.
No smoking questions this year?
Didn't ask any no smoking questions.
Chris, obviously, as you know, the station's based in Albany, so I'm going to ask a more regional situation here.
Sure.
Obviously, you focused on North Country opinion, but when you take a look at the results, which of these do you think have the most significance statewide?
Let me look at them again and answer that. Okay. The death penalty, buying drugs in Canada, CFE, of course, Medicaid takeover, SUNY tuition, and I suppose the war questions. Now, the second part of your question, though, is which ones are indicative. We know that the death penalty is a question that has vastly different opinions in New York City and North Country. So whether this is indicative or not, I'm not sure. What we already know also is we know the statewide polls on the death penalty, and they're turning against the death penalty a little bit more than they were. So for me, it's significant that the North Country is remaining as it is, but not surprising. CFE, I don't think it's surprising, but it is significant because I would venture to say that any rural district, or the city of Buffalo, or the city of Rochester, or the city of Utica, any upstate school district, you might find the same numbers about CFE. And frankly, the legislature needs to listen to that. The court order notwithstanding, the legislature needs to act to make that happen. I'm one of those who says we should not act, that the court order is moot, that it's irrelevant, that it can be challenged and will be challenged in court, and that we ought to keep our nose to the grindstone and do state aid for all school districts, and not precipitously follow that, in my opinion, unwarranted court order for New York City. Yes, it's a court order. Yes, we're obliged to obey the court order. On the other hand, my view is that we have already complied with CFE. That the actions the state has taken since 1995, when the case was brought, have more than compensated New York City schools. And that the argument needs to be brought back to the court to say, here is our CFE plan. It's what we've already done. And tell us how that doesn't meet your order.
On the flip side of it, when you show your survey results to your cohorts,
We are tied as we go to the fifth inning. It's 9-9.
Be patient in there. Start us up.
Scott Bombard
We're gonna throw you a good one.
leading off the fifth. Strike one. Hit to second. Cahoon to Mosley. One out. Now Jamie Manor. Strike one. Ellenberg has scored in every inning. Shazy, Champlain in every inning except the last one. 2 down.